The wind howled through the crumbling towers of an ancient Gothic castle perched atop a jagged cliff. Inside the dimly lit chamber, shadows danced as candles flickered against stone walls etched with symbols of power and death. At the center of the room sat Dracula, his piercing crimson eyes fixed on a massive tome bound in cracked leather. His pale hands moved deliberately, tracing over lines of text written in a language forgotten by time. For centuries, Dracula had ruled the night, his name spoken in whispers of dread. Yet, his dominion was under siege. Hunters armed with silver weapons and ancient knowledge grew more daring, and rival clans sought to topple his reign. His once feared influence was waning, and the thought of defeat festered in his mind like a poison. Dracula's lips curled into a grimace as he slammed the book shut, sending a plume of dust into the air. "This world has forgotten fear," he murmured, his voice like a serpent's hiss. "It is time to remind them." He turned his gaze to a pedestal in the room's corner, where a strange relic rested, a shard of glowing crystal pulsing faintly, as if alive. It was said to hold the key to summoning a force unlike any other, a weapon to restore his dominance. But the ritual required more than mere artifacts. Blood, sacrifice, and darkness were its price. Dracula relished the thought. Power, after all, demanded payment. With a wave of his hand, the castle's iron doors creaked open, and Igor shuffled inside. The hunchback servant carried a bundle wrapped in black cloth, his nervous eyes darting about the room. Igor had served Dracula faithfully for years, though the master's recent plans filled him with unease. "Did you find it?" Dracula's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. Igor nodded, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a brittle, yellowed parchment marked with arcane symbols. "The map, my lord. It leads to the burial site, just as you said." Dracula took the map and studied it, his expression unchanging. It depicted a long-forgotten cemetery, hidden deep within a cursed forest. There, the remains of Frankenstein's monster were said to lie, a creature forged from stolen flesh and animated by unholy science. The monster was a being of immense power, long believed destroyed, but legends whispered that it slumbered, awaiting the one bold or foolish enough to awaken it. Dracula's fangs gleamed in a cold smile. "Prepare the carriage. We leave at once." The journey to the forest was a harrowing one. The night seemed darker here, the moon obscured by twisted trees whose branches clawed at the sky. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries mingling with the rustle of unseen creatures. Dracula and Igor pressed on, the carriage wheels crunching over dead leaves and brittle bones. They arrived at the cemetery as the clock struck midnight. The place reeked of decay, and gravestones jutted from the ground like jagged teeth. In the center stood a mausoleum, its doors sealed with chains adorned with rusted padlocks. "This is it," Dracula whispered, his tone reverent and cruel. Igor trembled, but obeyed as Dracula commanded him to break the locks. With a crowbar in hand, Igor pried the chains loose, each snap echoing like a gunshot in the still night. The doors creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling into the earth. Dracula descended without hesitation, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they entered a chamber bathed in an eerie green light. In the center lay a massive slab of stone, upon which the monster rested. Its body was colossal, stitched together with visible scars that seemed almost alive. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, its chest unmoving. Dracula approached, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with anticipation. From within his cloak, he withdrew the crystal shard and placed it on the monster's chest. Then, with a dagger, he made a shallow cut on his palm, letting his blood drip onto the relic. The reaction was immediate. The crystal glowed brighter, and the room trembled as energy coursed through the monster's form. Its fingers twitched first, then its arms. With a gasp that sounded like thunder, the creature's eyes flickered to life. It sat up, its movements slow but powerful, as though waking from a long and restless slumber. The monster turned its gaze to Dracula, confusion and rage flickering across its face. It growled, a deep, guttural sound that made even Igor recoil. "Be calm," Dracula said, his voice steady and commanding. "You are mine now, and together we shall reclaim what is ours." The monster's growl subsided, though its glare remained fierce. Dracula knew this would not be an easy alliance. The creature was no mindless tool. It was a being with its own will and a hatred born of centuries of betrayal. Yet, Dracula relished the challenge. A creature of such power could be bent to his will, with the right manipulation. "Do you remember the world?" Dracula asked, circling the monster. "A world that scorned you, hunted you, and called you an abomination? I offer you vengeance. Together, we will make them bow." The monster's fist clenched, its massive frame trembling with restrained fury. It nodded slowly, its acceptance silent but undeniable. Dracula's smile widened. The ritual was complete, and his new ally was ready. Yet, as they ascended from the crypt, Dracula could not shake a lingering thought. The monster was strong, yes, but it was also unpredictable. For now, their goals aligned, but Dracula knew alliances forged in darkness often ended in blood. Still, he dismissed the doubt. He was Dracula, the Lord of the Night, and he always had the upper hand. As the two emerged into the moonlight, the stage was set for a new reign of terror, and for the storm of betrayal that was sure to follow. The alliance between Dracula and the monster was uneasy from the start. Their partnership was forged not out of camaraderie, but necessity. Both were creatures of vengeance, driven by hatred for a world that had rejected them. Yet their methods and ambitions differed. Dracula sought domination, an unchallenged reign of terror to cement his name in legend for eternity. The monster, on the other hand, wanted only destruction, to tear apart the society that had cast him out and mocked his existence. In the grand hall of Dracula's castle, the two sat opposite each other. The flickering torches cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls, amplifying the tension between them. On the table between them lay a map of the kingdom, marked with the locations of strongholds belonging to hunters, rival vampire clans, and mortal leaders. "The hunters are our first target," Dracula said, his voice smooth but commanding. "Their numbers have grown bold. They will not rest until we are ashes." The monster's glowing eyes shifted toward the map, his brow furrowing. "I do not care for hunters," he rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly, like distant thunder. "They are nothing compared to the ones who abandoned me. The cities, the men who called me a monster, they are who I seek." Dracula's gaze narrowed. "And what do you imagine comes after? Leave the hunters unchecked, and they will come for us both, stronger than ever. Focus, beast. The kingdom must be subdued, piece by piece." The monster growled low, but said nothing. He did not trust Dracula, but he needed his cunning. For all his raw strength, the monster lacked the strategy to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that bound this kingdom together. Reluctantly, he agreed to Dracula's plan. Their first target would be a hunter outpost in the northern woods. It was a small encampment, but it housed a stockpile of silver weapons and sacred relics, tools that could tip the balance in the humans' favor. The journey to the outpost was fraught with unease. Dracula rode in his black carriage, drawn by spectral horses that moved without sound. The monster walked alongside, his heavy footfalls crunching through the snow. Neither spoke much, their silence punctuated only by the occasional howl of a wolf or the rustle of wind through the trees. When they arrived, the outpost was as Dracula had described, small, with wooden palisades and a few guards patrolling the perimeter. Dracula crouched in the shadows, his movements as fluid as a predator's. The monster, meanwhile, stood in plain view, his massive form cloaked in darkness. "Wait for my signal," Dracula whispered, his crimson eyes glinting in the moonlight. But the monster was not one to wait. With a roar that shook the trees, he charged forward, smashing through the palisades like they were paper. The guards shouted in alarm, scrambling to arm themselves, but they were no match for the creature's brute strength. He tore through them with ease, their cries of terror echoing into the night. Dracula cursed under his breath, but adapted quickly. Using the chaos as a distraction, he slipped into the main building, where the stockpile was stored. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. He found the cache of weapons and set it ablaze with a single flick of his hand, the flames roaring to life as though they shared his thirst for destruction. By the time Dracula emerged, the outpost was in ruins. The monster stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving and his fists dripping with blood. "You fool," Dracula hissed. "Your recklessness nearly cost us everything." The monster turned to him, his glowing eyes blazing with defiance. "Do not presume to command me, vampire. I will not cower in shadows as you do." Dracula stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Recklessness will be your undoing, beast. Do not forget who brought you back from oblivion." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, their dark energies clashing like opposing storms. But then the monster stepped back, his growl subsiding. He knew he could not defeat Dracula, at least not yet. Their uneasy truce held, but cracks began to form. Over the following weeks, their victories grew in number. Outposts fell, rival clans were crushed, and the kingdom trembled under their combined might. But with each success, the monster's resentment of Dracula deepened. He saw the vampire's manipulations for what they were, an attempt to use him as a pawn in a larger game. And Dracula, for his part, began to see the monster as a liability, a force too wild to be controlled. The breaking point came during an assault on a fortified city. Dracula had meticulously planned the attack, instructing the monster to create a diversion while he infiltrated the city's cathedral to destroy a powerful relic. But the monster had his own agenda. Ignoring Dracula's orders, he went straight for the city square, where a crowd had gathered in fear. The sight of their terror fueled his rage. He tore through buildings, crushed soldiers beneath his feet, and roared his hatred into the night. But in his frenzy, he left himself vulnerable. A group of hunters, armed with silver-tipped spears, closed in on him. Dracula, watching from the cathedral's spire, saw the trap unfold. He hesitated. He could intervene, save the monster, and maintain their alliance. Or he could let the hunters do his work for him, ridding him of a dangerous rival. In the end, Dracula chose the latter. He remained in the shadows, watching as the hunters attacked. The monster fought valiantly, his strength unmatched, but the silver weapons burned his flesh, weakening him. As the monster fell to his knees, Dracula finally emerged. The hunters turned to face him, but they were no match for his speed and cunning. He dispatched them with ease, their screams echoing in the night. The monster looked up at Dracula, his eyes filled with betrayal. "You waited," he growled, his voice weak but laced with fury. Dracula knelt beside him, his expression cold. "You were careless," he said simply. "But I am not without mercy. Rest now and recover." The monster knew it was a lie. Dracula's mercy was as hollow as his heart. As he slipped into unconsciousness, he vowed that he would not forget this betrayal. Dracula stood, his crimson eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The monster was still useful for now, but their pact was crumbling, and Dracula knew it was only a matter of time before the creature turned on him. For now, he savored the victory, but in the shadows of his mind, he prepared for the reckoning that would surely come. The castle stood silent and foreboding under a blood-red moon. Storm clouds gathered in the distance, casting shadows that danced like wraiths across the towering battlements. Inside its walls, Dracula sat upon his throne of obsidian, his fingers steepled and his crimson eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He had spent centuries forging his power, and now the kingdom trembled under his rule. Yet, in the deepest corners of his mind, unease festered. The monster had disappeared after the betrayal in the fortified city. Weeks had turned into months, and still, there was no sign of him. Dracula had expected retaliation, an attack in the dead of night, or an ambush in some vulnerable moment, but none came. This absence unnerved him more than an assault ever could. The silence was not an act of surrender. It was preparation. The great hall echoed with the faint sound of wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls. Dracula rose from his throne and moved toward the massive window overlooking his domain. The land stretched out before him, a patchwork of shadowy forests and crumbling villages, all under his dominion. He had achieved much since the Alliance, but the cost was looming. The monster was no ordinary adversary. He was a force of pure rage, and Dracula knew that rage had been fueled by his betrayal. At that moment, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber. A servant, pale and trembling, stepped forward. "Master," he stammered, "there is the presence at the gates." Dracula turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "What kind of presence?" The servant hesitated. "It is him. The monster." A faint smile played on Dracula's lips. "He comes at last. Open the gates and let him in." The servant's eyes widened in horror. "Be but, master," Dracula silenced him with a wave of his hand. "Do as I command. He will not breach these walls uninvited." As the gates creaked open, a heavy fog seeped into the courtyard, coiling around the statues and dead fountains like a living thing. From within the mist, the monster emerged. His hulking frame was cloaked in darkness, his glowing eyes cutting through the gloom. Scars crisscrossed his flesh, and his movements were slow but deliberate, each step resonating with purpose. Dracula descended the grand staircase, his presence regal yet menacing. "You've come," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our arrangement." The monster stopped in the center of the courtyard, his massive fist clenched. "I have forgotten nothing," he growled. His voice was deeper than before, like the rumble of an earthquake. "You betrayed me, vampire. You left me to die." Dracula's smile did not waver. "You were reckless. I merely taught you a lesson." The monster's roar shook the castle walls. "Your lessons mean nothing to me. I am here to end this." Dracula's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Do you believe you can challenge me? You are strong, but strength alone will not save you." The monster lunged, his massive hand swiping through the air like a hammer. Dracula moved with preternatural speed, dodging the attack and countering with a strike of his own. The two collided like titans, their clash sending shockwaves through the courtyard. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the very air seemed to hum with energy. For hours, their battle raged. Dracula moved like a shadow, his strikes precise and deadly. The monster, in contrast, was a storm of raw power, his blows shattering stone and bending steel. The castle, once a monument to Dracula's grandeur, became their battleground. Walls crumbled, towers fell, and the ancient structure groaned under the weight of their fury. Yet, for all his power, Dracula began to falter. The monster's resilience was unlike anything he had encountered. Wounds that should have crippled him seemed only to fuel his rage. And beneath that rage was something Dracula had underestimated, a mind sharpened by betrayal and pain. The monster was no longer the simple brute he had manipulated. He had learned, adapted, and now he fought with purpose. Dracula's movements slowed as fatigue crept in. His crimson eyes, once filled with confidence, now flickered with doubt. The monster seized the moment, delivering a blow that sent the vampire sprawling across the shattered remains of the throne room. Dracula struggled to rise, his once immaculate form battered and bloodied. The monster loomed over him, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the room. "You thought yourself untouchable," he growled, his voice thick with disdain. "You thought you could control me." Dracula's lips curled into a defiant snarl. "And what will you do now? Kill me and take my place? You will become the very thing you despise." The monster paused, his glowing eyes narrowing. "I do not want your throne, vampire. I want justice." With that, he raised a massive fist and brought it down with all his strength. The impact shook the castle to its foundation, and Dracula's body crumpled under the force. The room fell silent, save for the distant rumble of collapsing walls. The monster stood over Dracula's broken form, his chest heaving. For a moment, he felt the weight of his victory, a hollow triumph in a world that had given him nothing but pain. He turned and walked away, leaving the ruins of the castle behind. The night was still, the red moon casting its eerie glow over the land. Dracula's reign was over, but the monster's journey was far from complete. He had won his vengeance, but the scars of betrayal and loss would remain. As he disappeared into the darkness, he knew one truth. In a world of monsters, the line between justice and vengeance was all too thin.